Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate. We're talking about that other migrant crisis, not the one in the Mediterranean, the one in Southeast Asia. According to the UNHCR, there could be an estimated 5,000 Rohingya Muslims and Bangladeshis who are cast adrift right now at sea. With us to talk about it from London, Tung Kin, head of Burmese Rohingya Organization UK. Welcome back, sir. Welcome back as well to Rezo Malakuti, Director of Migration Research at Altai Consulting. David Camroux, who teaches at the French Political Science Institute, Sciences Po. And from Washington, Sarnata Reynolds, advisor to Refugees International and who teaches at Georgetown Law School, ahead of a Wednesday meeting with counterparts from Thailand and Malaysia. Retno Marsudi, that's the foreign minister of Indonesia, had this to say in a newspaper interview. Indonesia is studying all possibilities, including the negative and positive aspects, before any decision making. We do not want to create a pull factor, that is to say that by letting in refugees, more will want to come. That was a sentiment echoed over the weekend by Malaysia's Prime Minister.
We're very sympathetic towards those who are floating in the open seas. Many were killed, including children and so forth. Because of that, we allow some of them to land and provide humanitarian aid to them. But Malaysia must not be burdened with this problem, as there are thousands more waiting to flee from their regions.
Sarnata Reynolds, he has a point.
He does, and it's a very difficult situation, and quite honestly, from the human rights perspective, we don't want to see people fleeing from Myanmar either. Every time a Rohingya person gets on a boat and leaves Myanmar, leaves his home in Rakhine State, he is helping the government to ethnically cleanse the country of the Rohingya. So it's a horrible situation to end up being complicit in the ethnic cleansing because your life is so bad.
But let's talk about the pull factor. Letting in those 5,000 that are adrift, is that just going to open the floodgates for more?
It's an understandable concern, but I don't think so. People aren't fleeing because they think that Malaysia might let them in. I mean, Malaysia obviously has had some good practices around this, but people also know that they could end up trafficked. They know that they probably will end up in detention. And they're doing it anyway because it's not what's going to happen to them when they get out that they're worried about. It's what's going to happen to them if they stay in Myanmar. And that's where the focus has to be. It's the push that's the problem. The pull, yeah, of course it's there. Some people might think, well, we'll make it there. Things will get better. But I think at this point, the people I've spoken to over the last 4 years, even more recently, the last few weeks, it is a desperation based on persecution, and they need out.
So, David Camroux, what's your prediction for that Wednesday meeting that is going to take place between those?
We are talking about a kind of slow-motion genocide or ethnocide in Rakhine State with the Rohingya. I'm a little bit optimistic about ASEAN. Why?
ASEAN, the group of Southeast Asian nations.
Yes, because of pressure from the grassroots. Many people in Southeast Asia are themselves migrants, migrant workers, Indonesians, Filipinos in other countries. They know what it's like to be abused and to suffer in those countries. And so I think at the grassroots level, we might see an uprising of opinion. The strongest civil society groups in the ASEAN countries are those concerned with migrant rights and those concerned with human rights. And hopefully they will have some kind of pressure on their political leadership. The problem at the moment is the blockage that comes from Thein Sein, the president, and the government, the civilianized military government of Myanmar, or Burma.
But forgive me for saying this. Could you see the same situation we're seeing, for instance, here in France, where you have vocal pressure groups defending the migrants, but if you take opinion polls, there's a silent majority in favor of current policies?
Yes, I think you do. You may have a similar situation, but that it's the more vocal groups that hopefully will have sort of some kind of influence. And the problem so far has been that in Myanmar, they refuse to discuss this in ASEAN context. They say this is a question of national sovereignty. This is infringement on our national sovereignty. This is not an issue to be discussed in a regional context. That is obviously a silly idea, to say the least. On the Hayes issue back in 1998, the same argument was used. And clearly when something happening in one country has an impact in other countries, then it becomes a regional issue. So ASEAN has a template about human rights. It has a commission. It's not very powerful on human rights. It has, if you like, mechanisms that can help to deal with this, but there has to be the political pressure both within the region itself, but also within Myanmar, and this is where it's appalling that the opposition is not taking a stand in Myanmar, to get the government to be willing to discuss this question in a regional context.
Tun Kin, do you share David Camru's optimism when it comes to regional leaders applying pressure on authorities inside of Burma?
Well, what we can see here is the applying pressure is not enough. You know, where I can see our relatives, our friends are facing serious persecution, and, you know, the bottom line here is the government having a policy, you know, the president thinks the government having a policy to drive out the Rohingya out of Burma. That is what he's practicing. He is succeeding. But the point here is, what kind of it need to be ASEAN, UN, UK, particularly UN have to intervene in this issue because it's been a long time going on. So it wouldn't be a stop, you know, if ASEAN pressure is good enough, but it wouldn't be a stop, that kind of low-level pressure. We need international pressure, a stronger way together, coordination of US, UK, EU, UN have to play a key role. Ban Ki-moon should lead in this issue where people are dying. You know, the government is putting a starvation and, you know, repression laws on the Rohingya. They're giving us two options: whether you want to live in camps without food, or you want to live from the country. That is two options the government have given to the Rohingyas. So we really need a stronger action and pressure by international community. Stronger. With ASEAN, you know, US, UK have to coordinate. So ASEAN alone will not be able to solve the problem.
All right. So you need.
So that is what I can say.
More than just ASEAN. By the way, we're talking about silent majorities. One reaction on Twitter, and there's more of them. Send them back to Myanmar, says Bam Seku. Your reaction to that, Areza Malakuti?
My reaction is that that's probably a very unrealistic response. And I think, as has been said by many of our guests today and panelists today, this is fundamentally a refugee issue. And these are people that are being pushed out of their homes because of the persecution that they are facing and because they cannot continue to live there. And so any argument...
By the way, on that point,
yes.
It's not just the Rohingyas, by the way. It is Bangladeshis, and those are economic migrants,
Sure.
but they're desperate enough to go.
Yeah.
So,
well, I think that it's a very good point, and I think that it's fundamentally a refugee issue, but it's true that there are some impoverished Bangladeshi migrants that are also using the same routes as the Rohingya and the same smuggling networks as the Rohingya. I don't know if we can really quantify the numbers at this point because this is essentially a clandestine movement, right? It's irregular, it's clandestine, so we can't really put a number on it. So we can't say what proportion of the flow. I would personally argue that it's probably a very small proportion of the flow. But regardless, I think that the discussion that was had about push and pull factors is still relevant. And, you know, when, as the previous speaker mentioned about, you know, these are extremely risky journeys where they know that there are a lot of vulnerabilities they will be exposed to, and trafficking is very possible, and yet they still undertake the journey. And I think that is the biggest proof that whether you are Bangladeshi or Rohingya, Rohingya, you are desperate and you are fleeing because you cannot remain where you are. And so the discussion about push and pull factors, or these policies, or accepting them acting as a pull factor, I think is a little bit unrealistic. And it's the same as the discussion in Europe as well. It's really the push factors that are relevant here, and not any pull factors.
All right, and another reaction, this one on Facebook from Nasir. Come to Pakistan, we welcome you.
No, I think what has changed is the Australian policy of pushing back the boats. The fact that a rich white country has shown that it can, it cannot obey international law, that cannot respect its commitments, at least it's debatable under the United Nations Convention. And by focusing on the traffickers rather than on the factors that are pushing these people to leave, this has changed the situation throughout Southeast Asia itself. Because basically what the Thais and the Indonesians and the Malaysians are saying, well, look, if the Australians can do it, why the hell can't we? They're a hell of a lot richer than we are. We can't afford to take these people in. And what makes the situation even worse is the Australian Prime Minister, Tony Abbott, presents the Australian policy as a model to be followed in Southeast Asia and a model to be followed in Europe in relation to the migrants in the Mediterranean.
Sarnata Reynolds, how did you feel when you saw the Australian Foreign Minister come here to Europe to tout the Australian model when it comes to pushing back migrants?
I mean, it's so devoid from the voluntary obligations that states entered into after World War II, realizing the extent of displacement, the extent of culpability, the collective guilt of having pushed away so many refugees who needed protection. It's so far removed from where this world was really after World War II. And it's incredibly upsetting. And the arrogance around that policy, the idea that pushing people back into the water where they will die when there are obligations to them and the government knows it, is a terrible, terrible precedent.
All right, one reaction on Twitter, it's just so sad, whether it's the U.S. southern border, North Africa to Europe, or these people, no man should ever be, quote unquote, illegal, says that viewer on Twitter. Rezo Malakuti, you're Australian like David. What? Again, it's the majority opinion clashes with what our viewer says, it seems, in your country.
The majority opinion in Australia clashes with this opinion. Yeah, well, I think that Australia has adopted some very, let's say, extreme policies in relation to migration in recent years. I think public opinion is probably shifting and changing in relation to that. I don't know what the most recent polls say, but I think I would agree that what Australia has, I think Australia's policy was one of turning the boats back in order to stop them from coming. And this was framed as a way to protect people because these sea journeys were so unsafe. So they were saying that people are putting their lives in the hands of smugglers who are taking them on these very risky journeys at sea. So we have to turn back the boats in order to stop this from happening. And I think that this, as was mentioned previously, has become a bit adopted by the region, that if Australia does it, then we can do it too. And as I mentioned previously, I think that what this has done has distracted the region from really looking at the root cause of the issue and really coming up with a comprehensive solution to the issue. So we've become so focused on deterrence as a way to protect people that we've lost sight of what the real issue here is and how we can work together, because I think that we have learnt in many parts of the world, same as the routes through the Mediterranean, same as Southeast Asia, that often there are many countries involved in these situations, and any response to the situation, for it to be comprehensive and to be a sound response, really needs to be a coordinated response with all those countries that are involved in the route and with a number of actors in those countries, addressing a number of vulnerabilities and working with a number of assets, if you like, or programs that exist in those countries.
All right, so there needs to be a coordinated international response. response. That brings us back to the point that Tun Kin made earlier. Tun Kin, you issued this plea to us saying that you wanted to see more of the international community, not just neighboring states, but also the UN, the European Union, to take part in the pressure to help solve this problem. Does the EU have a leg to stand on when you see that there are deep divisions over its own migrant crisis?
Yeah, for Rohingya issue, if you look at Burma, I will not talking about migrant issue. I don't see Rohingyas are migrant at all. These people are fleeing from the country because of they are facing serious persecution, where legal experts have said they are facing genocide, in our Rakhine state. So the Rohingya refugees are facing this kind of serious condition. EU have not speak up at all, including French government. We didn't see anything they have they spoke at all. And the other point is Rohingya situation getting much worse because of low level pressure, soft approach from EU and US, UK, because President Thein saying so-called reformer become a kind of more encouragement because international community lack of action. That is what I'm always pointing out. Because of this, you can see since 2012, about 20% Rohingya population, left from the country, flee from the country. So the government policy is succeeding, but international community action, to stop persecution against Rohingya is there is no interest at all. They just raising up the issue, talking about it, but no practical action. So EU have to come very stronger way to save the lives of the Rohingya in this critical time, including French government and UK, US.
David Cameron.
Yes, I mean, the European Union and the United States are in something of a bind. We've put so much store on this democratic transition in Myanmar. We want to see it succeed, the transition towards democracy. It's a long, rocky road with lots of ups and downs. But essentially, this transition is occurring in the Burma heartland, in the Shan regions. It's not occurring in the peripheral areas of Myanmar, including in Rakhine State, and that's the worst example. So the Europeans, somewhat like the Americans, somewhat are in a bind. They want to continue to promote this democratic transition, and yet those who they were hoping and they were betting on for the democratic transition, i.e. Aung San Suu Kyi and the National League for Democracies and other actors, are not taking up the cause of the protection of the Rohingya.
All right, and this, of course, reminds us of another facet of this, which is it's not going to be short term. And we've been talking about how this is a boat people situation. Now, if you say to a historian what the boat people are, starting in the late 70s, Southeast Asia witnessed, well, I guess what was then called the original boat people crisis. Desperate families fleeing Vietnam and Cambodia, falling prey to pirates. Many taken in at the time, David Cameron, by Indonesia on Galang Island. And the Indonesian foreign minister pointing out that they stayed there for 15 years.
Yes, and then some of them were taken in by the United States, Australia, France, many other countries. It's striking to look at the different attitude towards that boat people period of the 70s, because this was seen in a political context. This was the context of the Cold War. These people are fleeing, if you like, political persecution. Whereas here we have a situation in which people are suffering a form of ethnic persecution. And the sympathy of the Western world is not there as it was in the 70s.
Sarnata Reynolds, you agree?
I do agree with that. And I think one of the more complicating factors, too, is that the EU, the UK, the US, in opening up relations, have, of course, democratic goals. They also have economic goals. And one of the, sort of most stark questions is whether they are going to be willing to create consequences if the government of Myanmar continues to persecute and ethnically cleanse the Rohingya. Are they going to be willing to disengage in some ways, even if it has consequences for their economic pursuits? And that's really where we are right now, because nothing else is working. The U.S. government, I briefed them a lot. I mean, they care about this issue. It's important to them. But is it important enough to start rolling back some of the the assistance, the positioning, the sort of the political positioning they've created for the government of Myanmar. I don't know, but I think that's the really hard question that we are at right now. And that's probably the same for the EU and the UK. And if they're not all willing to do it at the same time, it also means that one of them won't want to do it by themselves.
And a final point on this, Rezo Malakuti, this Tuesday in Berlin, the French President François Hollande saying no question of having quotas for immigrants. We see Europe divided over a plan that was hatched last week to have quotas for some would-be migrants and asylum seekers.
Yeah, well, I think that, as was discussed last week, I think that interventions like this are really necessary in the short term so that we can, respond to this situation. And of course, it isn't going to solve or it's not a long-term solution to the problem. It needs to be coupled with other interventions in the medium term and the long term, but it is necessary in the short term to have a comprehensive response to this situation where we have so many people losing their lives in the Mediterranean and coming here for security and safety and asylum.
All right, the need for a comprehensive response, be it in Europe or in Southeast Asia. I want to thank you, Rezo Malakuti. I want to thank David Camru. I want to thank Toon Kin for joining us from London and Sarnata Reynolds in Washington. Stay with us. Our Media Watch segment is next. All right, and we're joined by Emma James. How are you?
Not too bad, thank you.
All right, you've been looking at the reactions in the media to the plight of the Rohingyas.
I have, and there does seem to be a real growing sense of anger and incredulity, really, when it comes to this story. Lots of newspapers and websites reporting on the latest on the disappearance of one of the migrant ships. The International Business Times here dubbing it the ghost ship. It's got something like 350 people on board. It was turned away by Malaysia, sent off into international waters in the general direction of Indonesia's Aceh province. It now hasn't been seen for 3 days. Now, when it was last seen, it was known that there was fighting going on board because water was running out, and apparently the men on board weren't allowing the women to drink. Now, what they're saying in this article is that they now know that the food supplies as well are going to have dried up. The last food they received was 3 days ago. It was 2 days, maybe 3 days worth at best. So really things looking very, very bad indeed for that particular group of migrants, Rohingya migrants. This tweet from Ken Roth, the Executive Director of Human Rights Watch, he says, every Rohingya boat is a victory for Burma's policy, rendering the lives so miserable for these Rohingya people that they actually flee the country. Elsewhere, there's growing criticism and questions being asked as to where is Aung San Suu Kyi. Now, The Guardian is one of those to pose that question. They ask, why is she so silent on this issue? The former dissident and, of course, now opposition leader, supposed to be the great diplomatic hope, if you like, for Burma, and a Nobel Peace Laureate as well, let's not forget that. She, they say, is an iconic figure of human rights, but she said nothing. They do point out that she's said before she fears any statement she makes will only fuel tensions between the Buddhist majority and the Rohingya. So The Guardian says she's basically choosing to dampen down ethnic tensions and really try to win votes from an electorate who have an increasing sense of Islamophobia rather than siding with the minority.
Keeping silent because otherwise it would inflame tensions. Do you agree? Does that make sense?
Or it would alienate her voters, unfortunately, as suggested, rather than in inflaming tensions. I mean, there have been Buddhist monks who have taken a stronger stand on this, so it is possible in Myanmar.
On to our next topic. It's
and
a bit
our
of
next topic, a bit of a shift. I feel for the photojournalists who go to cover war one day and the next day they're at the Cannes Film Festival, where a major fashion faux pas has happened.
It is quite incredible. It seems every day there's a new controversy down in Cannes. Today, it's all about the shoes.
Okay.
This tweet here, women thrown off Cannes red carpet at Carol premiere for wearing flat shoes. So much for the Year of the Women, because there was a lot of talk about that. The opening movie was directed by a woman. It starred Catherine Deneuve, a woman of the older demographic, which people really appreciated. But it seems the Cannes Film Festival has really slipped up because, as reported in Screen International, a group of women in their 50s turned up to see Carol wearing rhinestone flats, which apparently is just not allowed. And as they put it, it's actually flouting the rules of quasi-etiquette. The Croisette is the road where the film festival is held, and obviously they've combined that with etiquette to create this rather nifty word, which really explains it all. But as The Independent points out, there's a real irony in this story, because this group of women were turned away from going to watch a movie that is a lesbian romance all about fighting against societal norms. So really, they couldn't have chosen a worse moment to decide to...
So the fashion police is behind the tunnel.
Absolutely. Lots and lots of reaction to this online. This particular journalist from the United Kingdom says, utterly extraordinary. It's reported that women, including those with disabilities, are being turned away at Cannes for not wearing heels. Now, apparently, one of the women who went to see Carol had actually had 4 toes amputated. So, of course, she's going to be wearing flat shoes, but she wasn't allowed in. It really is quite remarkable. The stars are also coming out now. Emily Blunt says it's very disappointing that they won't allow flats on the red carpet. She says, I think everyone should wear flats. She's spoken to Harper's Bazaar, which is also talking about this. Flat shoes banned at Cannes. They say that at a press conference after Emily Blunt's movie, she said, I prefer to wear Converse sneakers. So we'll wait and see whether she braves that at any point. But apparently her co-stars and the director of the movie that she stars in, Sicario, have said that they are going to walk the red carpet in heels, her male co-stars, as a protest against this ban on flat shoes. So we'll have to wait and see whether that actually happens or not.
All right, we'll be watching the red carpet. Many thanks, Emma James. I want to thank our panel once again. Thank you for being with us here. More to come. And by the way, more on the Cannes Film Festival on our website, france24.com.